Second language acquisition is the process of gaining a second language. You have your native language, which is your L1, and any second language that you study or learn, it's gonna be your L2. So second language acquisition, it's an informal way of gaining the language, because you can learn a language going through formal learning, like going to a school or a classroom, and there's the informal way of learning, which is not really learning, it's acquiring, because you go in another environment where another language is spoken and naturally you are speaking. The second unit is about the development of language in young learners. There are three different patterns. The first one is for grammatical morphemes, the second one is for negation, and the third one is for questions. Each pattern has a certain communication starts at a very early stage. For example, it starts when babies start crying for things. If they're hungry or something is bothering them, they're just gonna cry, and that's the way of communication. Then it comes babbling. They start pronouncing some syllables. After this, it comes counted words, which they just produce words to communicate. For the last, it comes the telegraphic sentences, which the child is now able to produce a whole sentence in order to communicate. The behaviorist theory says that language comes as a behavior, and it states that this comes to reinforcement and imitation. This means that when the child is acquiring their native language, they learn it by imitating other people. And this theory explains that there needs to be an stimulus. For example, if a child is making a mistake at spelling, there's usually someone around them that tells them you are pronouncing it wrong, so you have to tell it in this way. This is a form of stimulus, because the child is noticing that it's wrong and then it's correcting itself, and it's supposed to not making it again. And a way to practice this in a classroom would be that if a student is saying something wrong, the teacher needs to correct them immediately. The innatist theory says that language comes natural, which means that babies are born with knowledge, and somehow they have a certain knowledge in the language. This is called LAD, which stands for Language Acquisition Device, which is like a chip that we are supposed to have in our brains, where we have all of the information of knowledge, in this case meaning the language. A way to apply the innatist theory in the classroom will be that the teacher introduces a new word or an expression, and the student needs to realize its full meaning, and then naturally the student is supposed to use it when it's speaking or writing the language. The cognitive theory talks about how children learn. They learn by making schemas. Then they get the schema about the information that they got, and they start to process it. For example, this happens in the classroom. If they are going through their books, we could say that they notice a word, and they are gonna process it, and then the student is gonna start using it on its own, and this comes with interaction. The sociocultural theory states that language is a social process because it comes with social interaction, but it also states that acquiring the language is also a cognitive process, because there are mental process where a child goes through to be fully able to communicate and use the language. An example of this theory in the classroom would be that the teacher puts two students to interact or to start conversating, and if a student knows more than the other, the one that knows less, it's gonna imitate the other because it's a social process that everyone goes through acquiring a second language. The Unit 4 talks about Krashen's second language acquisition hypothesis. The first hypothesis is the acquisition learning, which stands for that in the classroom there needs to be a balance between acquisition and learning. The teacher needs to teach certain grammar rules, but there also needs to be acquisition, and this comes through conversation and speaking and also listening comprehension. The monitor hypothesis is when the student is correcting himself or herself, and there are three types of users. The affective theory talks about how the students' feelings affect their learning. For example, if they are distracted, their affective filter is gonna activate, and they're not gonna learn if they're in the classroom. One way to apply this theory would be that the teacher at the beginning of the class can make an activity, for example, a little game to just distract everyone and then start learning, or the teacher can propose this activity if he or she notices that their students are not paying attention. The natural order hypothesis talks about how the knowledge that is being provided in the classroom goes through simple to complex. It's very important to have this natural order because students need to first learn the easier parts so that they don't get confused in while learning more difficult things at the beginning. And the last theory of this unit is the voluntary reading theory, which is when the student starts reading voluntarily, and it is very specific when it says that the student needs to be in an environment where it's quiet and silent, because if they are not in an adequate environment, they're not gonna really learn. So this theory says that a student can acquire or learn the language by reading new grammar rules and new vocabulary. The Unit 5 was about individual differences in second language learning. In my opinion, this is very important because every student is different, but for me it's very important willingness to learn, because if a student is not really willing to keep studying, he's not gonna want to be in there, and they're not gonna really learn it. Here is very common because a lot of parents force their children to study English because it's kind of necessary, but because the student doesn't really care, they don't really learn it. Another characteristic for SLA students is the have a certain goal. There's some students that study the language because they need it for their school, for their jobs, or they're traveling, or to get a certain certification. Another characteristic that is very important is the critical period hypothesis. This doesn't mean that because you're not in a certain age to learn it, doesn't mean that you're not gonna succeed. But the critical period hypothesis talks about that there is a certain age, which is through puberty, and this stands for 11 years old through 17 years old, which means that if the person starts learning or studying the language at that age, he or she is most likely to succeed at learning the language. The Unit 6 talks about the error analysis. Us as teachers, it's very important that we can identify our students' mistakes to correct them and to avoid them to keep making them. There are two types of errors. There's the interlanguage and intralanguage. The interlanguage is when there is a interference of the L1 in the student. For example, when a student is making a certain when the student is saying, this is very common when a student is first starting learning the language, because they tend to translate everything. So it's very common. For example, if a Mexican student wants to say a story in English, it's very common that they say history, and in English it's different concepts. And for interlanguage mistakes is when the student makes a mistake with a certain rule in the target language, and the student is making the error because maybe he or she does not know the whole rule, and that's why it's doing it. Another important concept about this unit is the concept of facilitation. When students make mistakes and you tell them that what they're doing wrong, and the student keeps making it, it's called facilitation. The Unit 7 talks about context for language learning. There are two types of context. The first is the natural acquisition context, which is where a person is exposed in a social environment and they acquire the language in a natural environment, where they, for example, they go to work and somehow they're going to start acquiring the language through a social environment. And the instructional context is where a student goes to a formal classroom or a school and goes to study the language or learn it. And the main focus on this context is that the student is focusing only on the language, and there is also the teacher, that the teacher is there to correct mistakes and make sure that the student is learning the language.